Good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to have you all here. And those of you out in cyberspace, welcome too. I got the idea for this topic when I was reviewing candidates for various political offices, particularly for the governor of Iowa. And as I was reviewing the candidates, I was thinking, well, what is it about them that actually really matters to me? And as I was developing the criteria, as I was reading their responses to questions that the interviewers had asked, it struck me that the criteria weren't entirely objective. That is, it wasn't just their positions on particular issues, but there were things about the candidate or the way they expressed themselves that made me realize that I held certain prejudices, you could say, or biases that were influencing how I perceived the candidates, how I perceived and received their answers, and perceived who they were and whether I wanted them or not. And I realized when I was doing that and had that experience that I think everyone does that, particularly when we meet people for the first time. And it wouldn't have to be political candidates, of course. It could just be anybody, somebody maybe we might want to do business with, a shopkeeper or such, or it might just be somebody we meet socially and would be considering, whether we want them to be a friend of ours. And it's funny how these biases, these cultural biases, get in the way. Now, what do we mean by a cultural bias? Obviously, we may have political biases, social biases of various kinds, but a cultural bias is a particular kind of, we call them memes, actually, little subroutines in our operating system. They're parts of our brain, if you will, or functioning parts of our brain that interpret data and help us navigate really everything that we do in life. And so, we see certain people and we perceive that it's safe to be around them. And we might perceive at least somebody someday that we would perceive, I'm not sure I want to be near this person. They could possibly, be violent or something. Or maybe we just, we see somebody in a store and they're having a bad day, as we say, and they're complaining about something and possibly to someone or maybe just standing there complaining. I've seen that happen. And, we kind of get the feeling, I think I'll go down the other aisle for now and just avoid that person for now. Now, there's a meme, there is a program inside us that says, if a person is muttering and angry and, maybe raising their voice and speaking very sharply and doing other things that we interpret as angry and frustrated and potentially connecting that to danger. Part of the meme is that we connect that kind of behavior to danger, or at least to a negative experience that we might have with them. We might just avoid that person. Now, someone else may come along and see somebody like that and have the completely opposite response. Oh, that person needs some attention. I'm going to go up and ask them, what's bothering them and have a little conversation with them. Maybe if they talk it out, they might feel better and then they'll be okay. And I'll feel like I've accomplished something. See how programming sets you up for the kind of interactions that you have with people and the kind of judgments that you make about people. I really like that example, actually, because it shows the kind of night and day attitude. As a physician, I pretty much had to see everybody that walked through the door. And not everybody that walked through the door was all that much fun. Sometimes people were sick and grumpy, or they hadn't been sleeping well, or something else was going on that made them just unpleasant. And of course, there were days, and I remember this all too many times, where I was a little behind on my patient schedule, seeing patients. And more than once, someone would say to me, I had to wait for a half an hour, or maybe even longer, to see you before, you got to me. And I had a ready answer for that. I won't tell you what it is now. It doesn't matter. But I had an answer for that, basically took the wind out of their sails, if you were. Basically what I said to them is, I know I was late. Patients before you needed special attention. And now I'm with you, and you'll get all the attention that you require. And that usually did it, actually. Most people responded very well to that. So it's the means, it's the programs, it's the way we're set up to deal with things that are coming our way that determine basically how we feel, how we function, how we interact with other people, whether we like other people or wish to avoid them. So cultural memes are very deeply set. Now, let's get into some of the more serious ones. Racial memes, racial biases are very, very strong, but they're not always things we're cognizant of. At least what I'm hearing from many politicians these days, they say, I'm not a racist. And yet, when we look at what they've been doing and saying, we get a pretty clear sense that there is within them a cultural bias. That's a nice polite term for it, isn't it? Right? There's this meme that's running inside them that means that when they see someone of a race other than their own, or some designated race that their bias says we don't like them, we need to be very careful about them. And, we may attach some specific reasons to that. And those reasons are, because this is a kind of prejudice, those reasons are usually not at all true. It's just something that we've learned. And of course, one of the things we're seeing in our society today is that people are repeating these kinds of biases and the reasons for them over and over again, so that people begin to believe that they're true and stop asking themselves, is this really true? Are these people really a problem? Are they a threat to me? I remember years ago when meditators moved to Fairfield. I was up in Iowa City in medical school in those days. And when meditators came to Fairfield, the local residents, most of whom had been here for a very long time and several generations, were kind of skeptical, shall we say, about their arrival and what that was going to mean to their community. And I remember one time after, I guess it was a couple of years that meditators were here in Fairfield in southeast Iowa, it's farm community as they call it. It's a very rural setting. And people like progress, but they don't like change. And so change had taken place. And I remember a shopkeeper saying to me one day that we knew how to take care of the Parsons College kids. If they got online, we just knock them up the side of the head. But meditators are all super nice. And he didn't really finish the sentence, but it had something to do with being very picky about things. Very, very, meditators want things just so, and then I want this, but not that kind of thing. And, or they'd ask an awful lot of questions, many more than most natives here would ask. And so the feeling was that these meditators were very different than the Parsons College kids, and were very different than the native Iowans that were here. Of course, when we say native, because everybody was imports from Europe, mostly Northern Europe. But the sense of who these people were, was a certain prejudice that got set up. And it was quite a number of years before there was sufficient interaction between the meditators and the people who had previously been the residents here to create some, I'll say camaraderie, some trust and some feeling that, yeah, okay, they're all right. They're a little different, but they're all right. We'll put up with them. So that's a local example that I think many people here are familiar with. And, I can actually remember, what should we say, an unpleasant incident or two where a local, was quite hostile towards me. Towards me? How could it possibly, But it was like that for some time. And I don't think that really happens overtly anymore. There's still some people, of course, who, have their reasons or have their feelings. But pretty much the communities are now very much integrated and everybody's comfortable. It's not really an issue. And of course, in the community, we also have a number of people of other racial backgrounds besides European Caucasian and Northern European Caucasian. And so there's some of that kind of thinking, that kind of meme running around to people that, oh, well, they're different, maybe we just kind of avoid them and look kind of askance at them and not be overtly friendly. And of course, that's absolutely not universally true, but there are examples of that still happen here. And, the fact that the university that's here in town is very much an international university, at times more than 90 different countries represented by students here, is something that the local people have had to learn to, just become comfortable with, just to accept the fact that it actually exists and that really it isn't a problem. But this kind of programming runs very deep, and usually we're not aware of it. One of the more recent forms of cultural bias that has emerged is the bias known as white privilege. And that works those who are white and those who are not white. And those who are white have a certain attitude that they're running the show. They know more, they're in charge. People should do what they say. And a lot of times people are not consciously aware that they hold that attitude, but that if they're in a group of people and there's mixed ethnicities, mixed racial backgrounds, they will kind of assume automatically inside their personalities, as I said, usually without even being conscious of it, that they should be responsible for whatever's going on in the room. They should be the leaders. They should be the people who do most of the talking, perhaps. And it's not always overt. It's not always something that people actually recognize. It's just the way they conduct themselves. The converse is also true. When people have come from environments where they have experienced that kind of racial discrimination, meaning distinction, making distinction, pardon me, they may also play the corresponding role. They'll hesitate to speak up, or they'll defer to white people who are in the room, let them speak first, or even move up closer to the front of the room if there's an orientation in the room like that. So sometimes subconsciously, even people who are on the other side of that white privilege line will play the reciprocal role. And if you were an observer, a fly on the wall kind of observer of a room like that, you'd begin to notice who was conducting the activity of the room and who was followers in the room. And as I say, it takes a little bit of education, of course, to become aware of these things. But as you're watching the room, you begin to get that sense, oh, there is a degree of white privilege operating in this room. It doesn't have to be white, of course. It could be other cultural groups, just depending where you are in the world. But that one in this country now is one that is making some white people begin to be aware. It's not really that they're racist. And if you were to ask them, they'd say, no, they're not racist. They give you lots of examples. I know lots of black people or whatever. But they don't even realize that they hold a certain attitude about their position in the social network going on in their environment. So This is the kind of example that I wanted to present this evening, so that people begin to think about, how do I function in a social setting? How do I function when I'm in a group of people? I left out probably the most common one of all. White privilege is common enough, of course, but in a group of all white people, how would you divide the room almost automatically? It's so deeply ingrained in our culture. Gender, thank you. I knew you'd come up with that. Yes, by gender, of course. So there's a male privilege, and males will tend to assert themselves. They'll tend to do most of the talking. They'll talk over or through women, which are meaning that a woman will start to say something, the man will interrupt, or the woman will be saying something and the man will just talk. And so there'll be like two people talking at the same time and neither one of them's listening to the other. So that kind of behavior is very, very common. And it's so deeply ingrained by cultural experience. This is not something that's natural. It's just something that comes from cultural experience. But it's so deeply ingrained that most people do not recognize that they're doing it. And it's very hard to become conscious of it. Fortunately today, as women in our society become very conscious of it, they're much more willing to point out when this kind of thing is going on. And sometimes it's polite and sometimes it's a little less than polite because they feel like the guys are being rude. So this is the kind of thing. I have a 14-year-old in the home. I'm very cognizant of how she handles herself amongst male peers. Does she defer to them, or does she act as an equal in their presence? And I've been very delighted to see that she very much acts as an equal in their presence. She doesn't give any ground to anybody. But that's not true of every female in the school. And so, it's one of those things that has to be explored if people are going to let go of those memes that are being programmed within them and being set up with them so that they can function effectively out in the world. It's not a difficult thing to do, but you have to check in with yourself and ask, yourself, am I treating this person equally, or is there something in me that may be prejudicing me in regard to how I treat this person? There are so many of these cultural memes. One of them has to do with weight. How much weight a person has, how much literally fat they have on their body. People who are exceedingly thin or who are exceedingly, the Yiddish word is saftig, it means padded, having abundance of fat, are often seen. There is a general cultural meme that that there's something wrong with them. They're either not healthy or they're not happy, or maybe both. But there's a certain prejudice that that's set up in many people's minds. Obviously not everybody's minds, but it's a pretty common meme. And that one crosses genders, by the way. It works both ways. And it's interesting that if you see people from other cultures, and you see perhaps a beautiful woman or a handsome man, they may not fit the cultural meme that we hold in this country, commonly, not everybody obviously, but commonly, about body habitus, the style of our body. And so these I'm using that just as another example, that these kind of memes pop up everywhere because as a culture, and we're not at all unique or abnormal in any sense of the word, but as a culture, we set up certain values that define a kind of inclusiveness. And then people who don't fit that, well, they're to some degree excluded. Now, not everybody does that, of course. Some people are very welcoming of people who are of different races, different religions, different skin colors, and so on and so forth. These days, oh yes, the other one is sexual orientation. And, there are people who have a great deal of difficulty with people who do not fit the usual binary division of male and female in our society. And other people, of course, are completely comfortable with that. And these days, the last, I would say, decade or so, I'm not going to count years, but something like that, gender issues have very much come to the fore. And, there's been talk about, homosexuals and transgender people in the military, so that there's very much a national conversation going on about such things. And, it's not my position to say right or wrong, but one of the things you might ask yourself is, if you've had an encounter with somebody who did not fit the binary gender model, how did you respond to them? Were you highly cognizant of the fact, and were you making any kind of accommodation, good or positive or negative, towards them? That is, were you being really friendly to them, maybe even extra friendly to them, and trying to make them feel like you didn't have any prejudice? Or was it a very, negative response? I'm not really interested in getting to know that person. I don't even want to be around them. Or was it completely neutral? You met them like you'd meet anybody else, and you never really gave their gender orientation much thought. You might have been aware of it, but not really thinking about it, not really holding that particular differentiation within your awareness. So a broad range of responses, to be sure, but these are things going on in our society that our culture is cultivating very strong feelings about, memes that we make, rules that we put into our operating system, into our brains for processing information. And when we're not aware of that, we may find ourselves in some difficulties sometimes. We may find that we're not being well accepted, that people are not feeling really good about us, and we have no idea why. And it may just be that a certain prejudice, a certain bias is emerging in the context of that social situation that we're completely unaware of. But somehow we're giving some signals off that are creating tensions in other people. The people are responding to us like, oh, well, I can tell you don't really accept the fact that I'm here. You're not really happy, or you're not really interested in being my friend or being genuine with me. You're going to be very polite, perhaps, but not really, sincere and deep as a person, in your connection with me. So it's important to recognize cultural biases. And I'm going to come back now to my original example of evaluating political candidates. It's important to recognize when I am judging somebody, but not on the basis of a set of criteria that I've really worked out and thought through, that certain subtle things are emerging in there. Let me give you an example that I'm aware of in myself. I don't think I actually have a big problem about it, but there are quite a number of female women who are candidates this year. And some of them tend to be very forceful in the way they present themselves, even more so than most of the male candidates. And it sets off in me something that says, is this person trying to impress me that they're really motivated, that they have passion, that they have passion about this issue or about their point of view? And are they doing that? And I'm asking myself the question, but not always consciously. Are they doing that to compensate for the fact that they believe that as women, their point of view will not be readily accepted by me or anyone else who happens to be hearing them. So I find myself at least asking that question sometimes. Whereas if I find a man doing the same thing, you know, being very outspoken about something and speaking very strongly on some point, I'm probably not quite as much going to react to them and sort of question what's motivating them. Are they compensating for their gender? Because after all, they're male and they don't have to compensate for their gender, because that's one of the cultural memes that we have in our society and that I carry, at least to some degree. So then I have to step back. The whole point of this is, of course, then I have to step back and say, am I evaluating the male and the female candidate who is outspoken on different criteria, rather than the content of what they're saying and the simple fact of their passion? Am I saying, oh, well, that person's compensating, but that person really believes what they're saying? So that's the kind of thing that we get into, and that's the reason why this whole thing got to be of such interest to me, because I really want to be fair when I evaluate candidates, and then I generally share my opinions widely. So I want to make sure that I'm being really fair when I evaluate candidates. And one of the things I thought about doing was not just listing the candidates and how they think on different points and how I think about them, but really looking to see if I'm evaluating everybody on the same criteria, and I'm really being fair to everyone, so that we're going to get a candidate nominated who is really going to be able to do a good job, of course, you know, as I would like the job done, you know, my particular preferences. So that's the background on all of that. That's why cultural biases are actually very important to us, and why we need to examine how we're thinking, what those little subroutines are that are running inside of us, running inside our thought processes, so that we serve ourselves well, and don't get caught up in prejudices that can be very limiting and deleterious to ourselves and, of course, to society. So I'm going to ask if there are any questions on all of that. If not, we'll end here and move into our group clearing session. Wow, I've done how many? 33 of these, and I still can't remember what it's called. Anything from the audience? Okay, I'm not seeing anything coming up on the Q&A or chat. Let me just check. Nope, not seeing anything there. All right. So with that, then, I'm going to conclude the presentation portion of this, and then I'll move and set up for the other part.